Chinese Premier Li Qiang is in Adelaide today during a 4-day visit to Australia.
The trip marks the first visit by a Chinese Premier to Australia since 2017, with the Australian government hailing it as an important milestone in the relationship with China. Stephanie Richards reports from Adelaide.
Well, after touching down in Adelaide yesterday afternoon, Chinese Premier Li Qiang will spend the morning here at Adelaide Zoo. He'll be joined by South Australia's Premier Peter Malinauskas, Foreign Minister Penny Wong and Trade Minister Don Farrell. Now, they're expected to make an announcement about the future of Wang Wang and Funi, two giant pandas currently on loan from the Chinese government. They were brought here in 2009 as part of the Chinese government's giant panda breeding program, but unfortunately, despite zookeepers' best efforts, they haven't yet been able to breed. Now, the leaders are expected to have a mixed welcome here at Adelaide Zoo. As you can probably see behind me, there are a lot of people here in support of the Chinese government, but there's also a lot of protesters protesting against what they say are human rights abuses by the Chinese government. Now, after this visit here at Adelaide Zoo, the leaders are expected to head to McGill Estate Winery. That visit comes after the Chinese government abolished heavy tariffs on Australian wine. That offered somewhat of a lifeline to an industry that has been struggling with global oversupply and low prices. The leaders will then, or the Chinese Premier Li Qiang will then head to Canberra for an annual meeting with Australia's Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. That meeting comes after the Prime Minister himself made a visit to Beijing last year, and the Australian government sees that meeting as being central to the stabilisation of the relationship between the Australian and Chinese governments.
That's Stephanie Richards reporting there, and our Foreign Affairs reporter Stephen Jedgetts joins us now from Canberra for more on this visit. Stephen, good morning. Aside from the pandas and panda diplomacy, what more can we expect from President Li's visit to Adelaide?
Look, after the panda diplomacy is done with, the Premier is going to head to a lunch with the Foreign Minister and the Trade Minister and some top winemakers in Adelaide. Now, the symbolism here is pretty clear. Obviously, wine is now flowing back from Australia into the Chinese market after those very hefty sanctions were removed by Beijing. So the government's determination here is to try and provide a picture of a relationship which is slowly stabilising, and to argue that that stabilisation is bringing real commercial benefits to a sector that was hit quite hard by China's acts of economic coercion. But of course, the symbolism does go both ways, because it's not only a reminder of the fact that wine's flowing back in, but also simultaneously a reminder of the fact that China was very happy to use its market share and its leverage over Australia to punish the former government for what it perceived as its hostile acts towards China. So it's a complex relationship, and every bit of symbolism around this visit is going to have this sort of duality to it. On the one hand, Australia wants to try and revivify ties with China. It wants a stable relationship where it can raise its concerns and continue to thrive economically. But at the same time, as everyone's aware, China is now a very different proposition to what it was, say, in 2010 or so. The relationship is much more fraught. Australia and China have different interests and very different visions of the world, and all of that will play out over the coming days, as well as the panda diplomacy and the toasts of red wine.
And Stephen, the Premier has talked about shelving the differences between Australia and Beijing. Given what you've just been speaking about, is that possible, and what do we expect from talks in Canberra tomorrow?
Yeah, it's not possible to shelve differences, and I don't think the Chinese government really believes that they can be shelved. What I think the Premier is trying to say there is that China and Australia can continue to have a good relationship despite the fact that they have very different views of the world. But what is at issue here is not just the fact that there are different views of the world in Canberra and Beijing, but at least if you look at it from Canberra's perspective, it's also about China's behaviour. So you see deep concern in Canberra about the fact that China continues to engage in extensive espionage in Australia, including cyber attacks, a deep concern about the fact that China and Russia are drawing much more closely together, and concerned about China's tacit support of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And as well as that, of course, you've got these deep concerns about the recent military confrontations you've seen between China and Australia in places like the Yellow Sea and the South China Sea. Increasingly tense encounters. No one has yet been seriously hurt, but Australia Australia is deeply worried about the pattern of behaviour there. And that's before you even go to those long-standing differences around, for example, Australians who have been locked up, like Dr. Yang Hun-jun. So there are a long list of differences. There is, of course, value in dialogue, and that's the government's argument. There's no point simply shouting in a bellicose manner towards China. All that does is lock you out of conversations where you might have some hope of shaping Beijing's behaviour, both towards Australia and globally. And the reality is, with all of that, is that there's only so much Australia can do. The government's conscious of that, but it says dialogue is still critical.